why I haven't been using a nice springy sound effect for when I pop up. Maybe I'll start doing that. Or maybe not, because that could be annoying. Hello, Muse. It's me. Yeah, it's me. Today I'm exhausted. I'm mentally and emotionally exhausted. This year has really put the floor in the basement below the ceiling into the I don't even know what I'm saying. I don't even have an analogy. I'm so exhausted I can't even come up with a good analogy for how this year has absolutely demolished humanity. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. I've been going on and on about certain things and neglecting one of the things that I really like to talk about, and that is craft of writing. So today, I'm going to go back to the craft of writing. Whee! Listen. Just listen. I'm going to preface this by saying that any of you who have been following me and listening in on the little conversations I have with my muse know that I tend to approach things in a very different way. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm not going to talk about in the typical fashion. I'm not going to break it down in a very pedantic method. This is not English Lit 101, nor has it ever been or shall it ever be. This is my method. This is my way of doing things, which is not the usual way. Why? Because I wasn't trained as a writer. I was trained as an actor. So I come from everything from a different perspective, a different point of view, a different POV, which is what we're going to talk about today. POV, point of view, perspective. Now, when I first started writing, I had no idea what I was doing. Absolutely no freaking clue what I was doing. I didn't. And I'm more than happy to confess that. I had no idea how to write. I could write. I had no idea how to put together a novel. I had no clue about the publishing industry. But even so, I had a story to tell. So I wrote it. I sat down one day and I said, I'm going to write a story. I'm going to write a book. Now, when you don't know how to do something, when you're not trained to do something, you approach it in whatever method you can. So I wrote the outline for A Blade Away. And then I decided early on that it was going to, the protagonist was going to be a female police officer. It was going to be set in Louisville, Kentucky, which is where I live. And I knew that the main character's partner was going to be a very flamboyant gay man. The inspiration for that character was Jack from Will and Grace, which I think that you could probably see if you read it now that I've told you where the inspiration for that character came from. So I approached A Blade Away in the only way I knew how. I wanted to tell the story through the main character's eyes, Jamie Davenport. So I started writing it through her perspective, through first person, past tense perspective. And very quickly, I realized that I couldn't tell the whole story through her perspective. Why? Because she only knows what she knows. And there are things going on outside of her world that need to be told. So I thought, okay, well, what I'll do is I will tell the story, the main story from her perspective, and then when I need to tell the story of the bad guy, I'll tell the story of the bad guy through third person past tense perspective. Aha! So I mixed my perspective. My first book. And I continued doing that for a while. Actually, the whole French Killer series is a mixture between first person and third person perspectives. Now, what are these perspectives? I guess I should have told you that in the first place. First person perspective is told through the eyes of the main character. It's as if the reader is in the head of the main character looking at the world through their eyes. Now, the main reason why I like to write in that perspective is because I find it to be very immediate and very intimate. Because you can really, if you write it well enough, you can convey a lot of very deep emotions and allow the reader to get really connected with that main character. Now, that requires you have a main character that the reader wants to connect to, which is a big problem for a lot of writers. And a lot of readers find that as they're reading a book in first-person perspective, if the main character is not interesting enough, it's going to get boring really fast. And another issue with first-person perspective is the use of the word I. I did this. I did that. I am going to do this, blah, blah, blah. You have to get really creative and you have to use your language to avoid repeating the word I all the time. That can get really taxing on the reader. So, if you write in first person's perspective, first POV, one POV, I don't know. After you've written it, or actually while you're writing it, go back and see how often you use the word I. And then get creative. That is the biggest downfall of first-person perspective. And there are other traps. One of the other traps that I used to get caught in all the time back in the early days was writing in first-person perspective while at the same time knowing what the other people were thinking. You can't do that. Unless your first-person perspective main character is clairvoyant, they don't know what other people are thinking. They can make guesses at what they're thinking. They can assume what people are thinking, but they can't know what the other characters are thinking. Right? That's where third person comes in, but only one particular third person. There's all kinds. There's just like in the music industry, there are subgenres. One of them is third person omniscient, where the narrator knows everything. Now, here's the thing about third person perspective that I find to be problematic for a lot of writers. It goes along with first person perspective as well. In third person perspective, you have to narrow down the characters that you're going to focus on. You can't just focus on everyone, because that's going to become incredibly confusing. So once you've narrowed down the characters that you're going to focus on, because third-person perspective is almost like a bird's eye view. Third-person perspective can see everything. So instead of first-person perspective looking through the eyes of the main character, third-person perspective is almost like looking through the eyes of a god or a bird. They can see everything. They see everything that's going on. So in my first novel, where I had first-person perspective through the eyes of Jamie Davenport, for all of her chapters, and then third-person perspective from the eyes of the omniscient character who could see the things that were going on outside of Jamie's perspective. I can't even remember where I was going with that. That's how scattered I am right now. And that's part of the problem with third-person perspective. When it gets too wide, it gets scattered, and you don't know where, the reader doesn't know where to focus. So, once you have narrowed down the number of characters that you're going to focus on, those characters have to be interesting. And that's part of the problem with third-person perspective. And it's also part of the reason why third person can get kind of cold and removed. Right? Because the characters that you're focusing on are not interesting. When they become interesting, not just individually, but when their relationships become interesting, the perspective becomes interesting. Now, I'm going to take it back a little bit because, again, I'm scattered right now, and I apologize for that. Usually I like to have these things kind of in some form, some thread, some form of of actual logic. My first introduction to writing a book that was pure third person perspective was Shiro. Now, there's a reason why there's a smile on my face every time I say the word Shiro, because Shiro for me is a very special series. Why is it special? Other than the topic at hand, the celebration of the transgendered community, Shiro is very special to me because the narrator is very special. I learned very early on in my writing career that one of the best ways to make third-person perspective work, again, this is just for me, is to take on the personality of the narrator. So, in most of my books that are third person, I am the narrator. I am. So that narrator takes on a layer of personality. When I'm reading a book that is the third person perspective, and I find the narrator to be boring, the book is boring. It doesn't matter how amazing the story is, how incredibly well thought out and well fleshed out the characters are. If the narrator is boring, the book is boring. Because the narrator in a third-person perspective book has the majority of the words. Unless your book is very heavily laden with dialogue, the narrator's the main character. Or not the main character, but the narrator is the primary vehicle for the story. Now, in my books, as I kind of slip there, my narrator in third person takes on a personality. Part of that is because for me, at least in my reality, humor is kind of a defense mechanism. It is a survival tactic for me. It always has been since I was a little kid. Because when I was in elementary school, I was one of the smallest kids. Actually, from birth on to now. I'm almost always one of the smallest people around. There are exceptions to the rule, of course. And so in high school, I learned that in order to save my ass, I had to be funny. Now, I'm not patting myself on the back because you know I don't do that. I'm not saying that I'm a comedian. I'm not a comedian. But when I get in a crowd, something clicks, and the actor in me comes out, and I start performing, and I make people laugh. That's not to draw attention to myself. That's just to make people laugh, mostly. But back in high school, a lot of times it was a means of protection, because when I make people laugh, people like me. People are less likely to hate me. People are less likely to punch me in the face. Sometimes because if they punched me in the face, they probably knew that I would then mock them in such a way that I would have the whole school turning on them. Anyway, my point is, when I take on a book and write it as third-person perspective, most often I am the narrator, unless there are certain extenuating circumstances that tell me I can't do that. And there have been instances where I could not do that. For example, Hell's Muse, right? I couldn't inject me as the narrator in Hell's Muse. Now, Hell's Muse that whole series is another series of books wherein I use a mixture of first person and third person perspective. The first person perspective, especially in the first book, there's a lot of me in that. The third person, however, focuses on hell. Literal hell. So I had to I had to use a persona, or I developed this idea of this persona for the narrator, what that narrator looked like and what that narrator sounded like and what that narrator thought. And that is one of the tricks that I use when I'm writing third person perspective when the narrator is not me. I come up with a character for that narrator. I flesh the narrator out because I want that narrator to have dimension. I don't want my narrators to be shallow. I don't want them to be robots. I don't want to write a book that Siri could have written. Right? I want my readers to enjoy the journey, not just on a level of the story, but a level above that as well. I want them to be able to connect with the story, with the characters, with the narrator, and with me. And that is kind of the sandwich that I make for myself as a writer. Story, characters, narrator, me. It's all there. It has to be all there. And for me, if one of those pieces is missing, regardless if you're in first person or third person perspective, if one of those pieces is missing, the story doesn't work. Or the book doesn't work, I mean. So, how do you make third person as intimate as first person? You give the narrator a personality. Read Shiro, especially the third book in the Shiro series, because the narrator wasn't quite as developed in the first book as he was in the third book. But you will immediately discover that narrator is as much a character as any of the other characters in the book. So don't allow your narrators to be removed, even though they tend to be godlike in third person omniscient perspective. It doesn't mean they can't be interesting. Now, the one thing you want to avoid, however, is you want to avoid, unless there are extenuating circumstances and the story depends on it, you don't want the narrator necessarily commenting on the story. It's okay if it works. If it works within the realm of the book, it's okay. But third person is there to be able to tell the whole story. And most generally not take sides. Right? I mean, you can. I have narrators that take sides, obviously. But there are ways. Obviously, first person is very intimate because it's in the head of the main character. And there are ways to make third person as intimate as that. And there are ways you can avoid all the pitfalls. You know, first person perspective, can't know the thoughts of the other characters. And really, ultimately, what I decide, how I decide which perspective I'm going to use is actually really simple. When I come up with an idea for a story, I decide, does this story need to be told, or does it have to be told through the eyes of the main character? Does it require that level of intimacy? If I tell this story through third person perspective, will it lose something in the translation? Or is this story big enough or too big to be told through first person perspective? Does it need to be, does the narration of the book need to extend beyond the main character? just like what happened with A Blade Away. When I realized that I had to service the story, I had to be able to tell the story not just through the eyes of Jamie Davenport, but through the eyes of an omniscient narrator who would know things that Jamie couldn't know. It's a thriller. It had to be that way. Mostly because I wanted to develop this protagonist and tell a backstory that Jamie couldn't know. And I didn't want the backstory of that character to be told through articles and books and things that Jamie would discover along the way. I wanted the audience to discover them as well. Same thing happened with iZombie. When I originally wrote the book, it was in first person present tense, which was impossibly difficult to write. And then my editor said, we need to rewrite this in first person past. And we almost said, let's try to write it in third person, but I said, no. No. This book has to be written in first person point of view. Has to. That's it. I won. Well, we both won. It was a compromise. But anyway, that's my take on perspective. I know it's a little scattered today. It's a little crazy. Maybe you didn't understand it. Maybe I didn't help you at all. Hopefully I helped you some, because that's my goal in life, is to help you. And if not, maybe at least I entertained you for a second. Who knows? Who cares? I do care. Wait a minute. Don't say who cares. I don't say who cares. I don't say I care. I care so much. Sometimes I care too much. Anyway, perspective. First person, third person. Write the book in the perspective that will serve the story the best. It really just boils down to that. Start writing it. And if it doesn't work in that perspective, rewrite it. Just do yourself a favor and discover that really quickly. Because rewriting an entire book in a different perspective is akin to rewriting the whole book completely. Anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening, Muse, because I know, I think I bored you on this one, Muse, because you wanted me to talk about you. Arrogant Muse. I'm kidding. You're not arrogant, Muse. You're not arrogant at all. In fact, you, Muse, are awesome. I missed it. I did it wrong. Let me try that again. Let me reload it. You, Muse, are awesome.